Somewhere in the quiet hills of France, in the winter of 1943, a woman dressed all in black poured a glass of deep red wine, watched a Nazi general drink every last drop of it, and then simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but an empty bottle, an overturned chair, and a mystery that has never been solved, not in more than 80 years. And before I go any further, let me tell you exactly why you are going to want to stay for every second of this, because the story I am about to share with you is not the kind of story you read in a history book. It is the kind of story that people whisper about in the dark, the kind of story that makes you stop and wonder what a quiet, gentle, God-fearing woman is truly capable of when she is pushed past the point of no return. And if you love hidden stories about brave women, wartime heroes, secret missions, and the incredible true events that changed lives forever, then you are in the right place, because this is the Secret Nun. And if you are not already subscribed, I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to hit that subscribe button, because I bring you stories like this every single week, stories that almost nobody else is telling, and I promise you, once you hear this one, you are going to want to tell every single person you know about it. So let me set the scene for you, because to understand what happened that night, you have to understand the world this woman was living in, and the world she was living in was a world that had already been broken. It was France in the middle of the Second World War, and the country had been carved up like a piece of meat on a butcher's table. The northern half was occupied by the German army, and the southern half was supposedly free, but even the supposedly free part lived under the shadow of a government that had surrendered its soul, and everywhere you looked, there were men in grey uniforms, and there were checkpoints, and there were curfews, and there was hunger, and there was fear, and in the middle of all of that darkness, tucked away in a stone convent that had stood for 400 years, there was a community of nuns who had dedicated their entire lives to prayer and silence and service, and among them was a woman whose name I want you to remember, because even though history has tried very hard to erase her, her name matters, and her name was Sister Marguerite. Now, Sister Marguerite was not the kind of woman who drew attention to herself, and that was the whole point, because the best way to survive in occupied territory was to become invisible, to move through the world so quietly that nobody even remembered you had been there, and she was very, very good at being invisible. She was small, she was soft-spoken, she had gentle hands and a face that people described as kind, the kind of face that made frightened children calm down and made wounded soldiers stop crying, and for most of her life, nobody outside those convent walls had any reason to even think about her at all. She spent her days in the garden, and in the kitchen, and in the chapel, and she did the quiet work of keeping a small community alive during a war, which meant growing vegetables in soil that was barely fertile, and rationing out flour so that nobody went completely hungry, and sneaking medicine to families who were too scared to go to the local doctor, because the local doctor had been replaced by a man who reported everyone to the Gestapo. And this is the part of the story I need you to really sit with, because it matters. Sister Marguerite was not a soldier, she had never held a weapon in her entire life, she had taken a vow of peace, and yet, by the time this story is over, she would do something that most trained soldiers would not have had the nerve to do, and the reason she did it was not because she wanted to be a hero, it was because she watched a man do something so monstrous that she simply could not stand by and let it happen again. And that man was General Klaus von Richter, and I want you to understand who this man was, because he was not some anonymous officer passing through, he was one of the most feared men in the entire region. He was a decorated general who had been sent to this particular corner of France because the resistance movement there was becoming a problem, and his job was to crush it, and he was very, very good at his job, the way a butcher is very good at his job. He did not see the people of that region as human beings, he saw them as problems to be eliminated, and the stories about what he did to the families he suspected of helping the resistance were so terrible that mothers would use his name to frighten their children into obedience. They would tell their little ones that if they did not behave, General von Richter would come for them in the night, and that was not an exaggeration, that was not a fairy tale, that was the actual reality of living under that man's shadow, and he had made his headquarters in a grand chateau just a few kilometers from Sister Marguerite's convent, which meant that she saw his men almost every single day. She saw them patrol the roads, she saw them search the homes of her neighbors, she saw them drag people out of their houses in the middle of the night, and every single time, she lowered her eyes and said nothing, because saying something would have meant death, and so she kept her head down and she prayed, and she told herself that this was not her fight, that she was a woman of peace, that God would handle the wicked in his own time. But then came the day that changed everything, And I want you to picture this scene very clearly, because it is the moment that turned a peaceful nun into something else entirely. It was a cold morning in early December, and Sister Marguerite had been sent into the village to collect a few things for the convent, and she was walking back up the hill toward the stone gates when she heard the sound, and at first she did not understand what she was hearing, because it was a sound that did not belong in that quiet place. It was the sound of shouting, and the sound of a woman crying, and the sound of a man laughing in a way that was not joyful at all. It was the sound of a man enjoying someone else's pain, and when she reached the top of the hill, she saw it. She saw General von Richter himself standing in the middle of the village square, and at his feet, on the cold ground, was a family, a mother and a father and 3 small children, and the youngest of those children was a little girl who could not have been more than 6 years old, and that little girl was shaking so hard that her whole body was trembling like a leaf in a storm, and Sister Marguerite watched, frozen in place, as the general lifted that little girl's chin with the toe of his polished boot, and he said something to the parents, something about how he knew they had been hiding a resistance fighter in their barn, and he gave them one chance to tell him where the man had gone, and when the father stammered that he did not know, that there had been no one, the general simply shrugged, and he raised his hand, and Sister Marguerite understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like ice water poured directly into her heart, that this man was going to have those children killed in front of their own parents, not because he needed information, but because he enjoyed it, because cruelty was not a means to an end for him, it was the end itself, and something inside of her, something that had been sleeping her entire life, opened its eyes. And here is where the story takes its first sharp turn, because in the end, the family was not killed that morning. The general decided that terror was more useful than death, and so he let them live, but he made sure they would never forget. He had their home burned to the ground, and he had the father taken away to a labor camp, and he left the mother and her 3 children standing in the frozen square with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and Sister Marguerite stood there and watched the whole thing, and she watched the way the general climbed back into his black car with a satisfied smile on his face, and she watched the way the smoke from that burning house climbed up into the gray winter sky, and she realized something that she had never allowed herself to realize before. She realized that the war was not something happening far away, in other countries, to other people. It was here, it was now, it was standing in her village, and it had looked directly at 3 small children and smiled, and that night, back in the quiet of her stone cell, Sister Marguerite got down on her knees to pray, but for the first time in her life, the prayers would not come, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw that little girl's trembling body, and she saw that general's polished boot, and she understood that if she did nothing, if she simply went back to her garden and her prayers and her quiet little life, then she would be complicit, and that was the thought that would not leave her. That was the thought that kept her awake as the hours crawled toward dawn, the thought that a woman who had dedicated her life to peace was about to become, in the eyes of history and in the eyes of God, something far more complicated. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where a lot of people try to make it simple, and it was not simple. Sister Marguerite did not wake up the next morning and decide to become an assassin. That is not how real life works. Real life is slow and messy and full of doubt. And so for the next several weeks, she did what she had always done. She tended the garden, she cooked the meals, she prayed in the chapel. But now there was a thought living inside of her, a thought that she could not shake no matter how hard she tried. And the thought was this: what if the next time that general decided to hurt someone, she was the only person in the world who could stop it? And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had something that no soldier and no resistance fighter had. She had access, because you see, the general had developed a very particular habit, and that habit was going to become the crack in his armor, the one weakness in a man who seemed to have no weaknesses at all, and I am going to tell you exactly what that habit was, because it is the key to everything that happened next. The general, for all his cruelty, was a man of refined tastes. He loved fine food, and he loved fine wine, and he had made it known throughout the region that the best of everything was to be delivered to his chateau, and the convent where Sister Marguerite lived happened to have one of the most famous wine cellars in all of France, a cellar that had been built up over centuries, filled with bottles that dated back before the First War, bottles that wine collectors in Paris would have wept over. And when the general heard about this cellar, he demanded that the nuns begin delivering their best wine to him, and the Mother Superior, terrified of what this man might do to the convent if they refused, had agreed, and so it had become Sister Marguerite's duty, because she was the one who could move most quietly, to carry the wine up the hill to the chateau, to walk right past the guards, to step through the front door of the general's own headquarters, and to place the bottles directly into the hands of the man himself. And I want you to really understand the power of that, because in a world where that man was surrounded by walls and guards and fear, there was exactly one person who could walk into his home carrying something he would happily drink, and that person was a quiet, gentle nun with soft hands and a kind face and a growing certainty that she had been placed in this position for a reason. So she began to plan, and I want you to understand how careful she was, because this was not the work of a moment, it was the work of weeks, and every single step of it had to be perfect, because one mistake, one small slip, would mean not just her own death, but the death of every single nun in that convent, and the general would have made sure that those deaths were slow and public and terrible. So she moved with a patience that would have impressed the most hardened intelligence officer, and the first thing she did was learn everything she could about the general's routines. She learned what time he ate his dinner, and she learned which servant poured his wine, and she learned that he had developed a habit of drinking a particular vintage late in the evening, alone, in his study, after all the officers had gone to bed, and she learned that he trusted his wine cellar keeper completely, because the keeper was a Frenchman who had been allowed to keep his position in exchange for absolute loyalty, and the keeper was terrified, and terrified men do exactly what they are told, and so the keeper never questioned anything that arrived from the convent, because the convent was full of nuns, and nuns, in the mind of a man like that keeper, were not capable of harm, and that, more than anything else, was Sister Marguerite's greatest weapon, not the poison, not the plan, not the access, but the simple, devastating fact that nobody in that entire chateau could imagine a nun doing what she was about to do. And now I have to tell you about the poison, because this is where the story gets its name, and this is where the legend and the facts begin to blur together, and I want you to listen closely, because the truth of what happened next has been argued about by historians for 80 years, and nobody, not one single person, has ever been able to say with certainty how she did it. But here is what we do know. We know that in the weeks leading up to that winter night, Sister Marguerite began spending more and more time in the convent's small infirmary, and the infirmary was run by an elderly nun who knew more about herbs and plants than any doctor in the region, because in a time when real medicine was scarce and expensive, the nuns had learned to treat the sick with what grew in their own garden, and among the things that grew in that garden, or in the wild woods beyond it, were plants that could heal, and plants that could do the exact opposite, and Sister Marguerite, who had spent years helping in that infirmary, who had watched the old nun prepare remedies and tonics, knew exactly which plants those were, and so, in the quiet hours of the night, she began to learn, and she began to prepare, and she asked careful, innocent questions that the old nun answered without ever suspecting a thing, because who would ever suspect gentle little Sister Marguerite of wanting to know how to turn a beautiful, harmless-looking flower into something that could stop a man's heart? And here is the part that I find genuinely chilling, and I think you will too, because the poison she chose was not some dramatic, obvious thing, it was subtle, it was patient, and it was almost undetectable, and the reason that matters is because it tells you exactly what kind of woman she had become. She did not want a loud, violent death, she did not want to storm into that chateau with a weapon, she wanted the general to drink his wine, and go to bed, and simply never wake up, and she wanted the world to think it was an illness, a heart attack, a stroke, anything but murder, because if the death looked natural, then no one would go hunting for a killer, and if no one went hunting for a killer, then the convent would be safe, and her sisters would be safe, and she could slip away into the night and disappear. And that, right there, is the mind of a woman who has thought everything through, who has accounted for every variable, and who has decided that the only way to save the innocent is to become the one thing she had promised God she would never become. But before she could carry out the plan, she had to survive the carrying, and this is where the tension of the story lives, because every single time she walked up that hill with a bottle of wine in her hands, she was walking into the lion's den, and every single time, something could have gone wrong, and there were moments when it almost did. There was the afternoon when one of the guards, a young man with cruel eyes, stopped her at the gate and demanded to know what was in the basket, and she stood there, calm as still water, and she told him it was wine for the general, and she lifted the cloth so he could see the bottles, and the guard looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that he could see right through her, that he could see the truth written on her face. But then he just laughed and waved her through, because she was a nun, and in his mind, a nun carrying wine was about as dangerous as a lamb carrying a knife, and she walked through those gates with her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, and she learned something in that moment that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. She learned that the greatest disguise in the world is not a mask, it is being exactly what everyone expects you to be. And so the weeks passed, and the winter grew colder, and Sister Marguerite waited, because she understood something that most people who plan such things never understand. She understood that timing was everything, that she could not strike too early, when suspicion might still fall on the wrong people, and she could not strike too late, because every single day that the general remained alive was another day that he might hurt someone else, another family, another child, another village burned to the ground, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, and it was in those long, dark weeks of waiting that she made her final peace with what she was about to do. And I want you to understand this, because it is the emotional heart of the entire story. She did not become a killer in the way that you or I might imagine, with hatred burning in her heart. She became a killer out of love, a strange, terrible, sacrificial kind of love, and she told herself that she would answer to God for what she was about to do, and that she would accept whatever punishment awaited her, as long as it meant that no more children would have to stand trembling in the frozen village square, as long as it meant that the smoke would stop rising from the homes of the innocent. And if that is not the definition of courage, then I do not know what is. And then, finally, came the night, and I want you to settle in here, because everything from this point forward moves very, very quickly, and you are going to want to catch every single detail. It was the night of a dinner, a grand dinner that the general was hosting for several of his senior officers, a celebration of some victory or another, and the kitchen of the chateau had been working for days, and the wine had been ordered, and among the bottles that were to be served that night was a very special bottle, a bottle that Sister Marguerite herself had carried up the hill that very afternoon, and I want you to hold on to that detail, because it is the detail that has haunted investigators for 8 decades, because nobody, not the kitchen staff, not the winekeeper, not a single one of the officers at that table, could ever say with certainty which bottle it was, and yet, at some point during that dinner, a bottle was opened, and a glass was poured, and a toast was made, and the general, surrounded by his officers, raised his glass, and he drank, and he smiled, and he went on with his evening as if nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed, and now I have to tell you about the hours that followed, because this is where the story becomes almost unbearably tense. The dinner ended, and the officers retired to their rooms, and the general, true to his habit, retreated to his study with one final glass of wine, the good stuff, the bottle that had come from the convent, and he sat there in the candlelight, going over his papers, planning his next move against the resistance, completely unaware that the last thing he would ever taste in this world was already moving through his body, and according to the accounts of the servants who were there that night, the first sign that something was wrong came around midnight, when the general rang for his aide, and when the aide arrived, he found the general slumped in his chair, his face grey, his hand pressed to his chest, and he was complaining of a terrible pain, a burning in his throat, a weakness in his limbs, and the aide, panicking, called for the doctor, and the doctor came, and he tried everything he knew, but there was nothing to be done, and by the time the sun rose over the frozen hills of France, General Klaus von Richter, the man whose name mothers used to frighten their children, the man who had burned homes and broken families and smiled while he did it, was dead, and the official cause, written down in neat German script, was a sudden and catastrophic heart failure. And you might think that this is where the story ends, the villain is dead, the hero has won, roll the credits, but no, because the most extraordinary part of this story, the part that has kept people awake at night for 80 years, is only just beginning. Because when the sun rose that morning and the news of the general's death began to spread through the chateau, someone went to the convent to speak with the nuns, and that is when they discovered that Sister Marguerite was gone, and I do not mean that she had slipped out for a walk, I mean that her cell was empty, her few belongings were missing, her bed had not been slept in, and there was no note, no explanation, no farewell, nothing at all, and when the Mother Superior was questioned, she could only shake her head in genuine confusion, because as far as she knew, Sister Marguerite had gone up the hill to deliver wine the previous afternoon, and she had simply never come back, and that was the moment when the first cold finger of dread touched the people who were investigating the general's death, because they began to understand, slowly, and then all at once, that the quiet, gentle nun who had been walking in and out of their chateau for weeks, the woman they had all looked at and seen nothing but a harmless servant of God, might have been the most dangerous person in the entire region. And so the hunt began, and I want you to understand the scale of it, because it tells you just how badly they wanted to find her. They searched the convent from top to bottom, they questioned every single nun, they interrogated the wine keeper until the man was a broken shell of himself, they set up roadblocks on every road leading out of the region, they went door to door in the village, and they found nothing, not a trace, not a witness, not a single person who had seen a small, soft-spoken nun walking anywhere near the chateau after she had delivered that wine, and the officers who led the search began to realize, with a growing sense of unease, that they were not dealing with an ordinary woman, they were dealing with someone who had planned this with a level of precision that bordered on the supernatural. Because how does a nun, a woman with no money, no connections, no training, simply vanish into the middle of a war-torn country without leaving a single footprint behind? And the answer, the terrifying answer that they refused to write down in their reports, was that she did not vanish by accident, she vanished because she had always intended to, because the vanishing was part of the plan from the very beginning. And this is the part of the story where I have to level with you, because this is where the facts run out and the mystery begins, and I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story that gets told on the internet, a version with a clean ending and a tidy moral, but the truth is messier, and the truth is that nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever been able to prove what happened to Sister Marguerite after she walked out of that chateau, and so what I am about to tell you are the three main theories, and I want you to listen to all three, and then I am going to ask you a question at the end, and I genuinely want you to answer it, because I have been thinking about this story for a very long time, and I still do not know what I believe. The first theory, and the one that the resistance movement itself eventually embraced, is that Sister Marguerite did not vanish into thin air at all, that she had been planning her escape for weeks, that she had made contact with the local resistance through channels that even the Germans could not trace, and that on the night of the poisoning, after she had delivered that final, fatal bottle, she simply walked out of the chateau, met a resistance contact on the road, and was smuggled out of the region, and then out of France entirely. And the people who believe this theory point to a very strange detail. They point out that in the years after the war, several resistance fighters came forward with stories of a mysterious nun who had appeared in their safe houses at various points during 1944, a nun who never stayed long, who never gave her real name, who helped with the wounded and then slipped away in the night. And while none of these accounts could ever be confirmed, the people who believe this theory say that it makes perfect sense, that a woman who had just poisoned a Nazi general would not go back to her quiet life, that she would have thrown herself into the fight, that she would have spent the rest of the war doing exactly what she had done that winter, saving the innocent from the shadows. The second theory is darker, and I want you to brace yourself for it, because it is the theory that the officers who hunted her came to believe, and it is this, that Sister Marguerite never escaped at all, that the Germans caught her within hours of the general's death, that they identified her, and that they made her disappear in the most brutal way imaginable, and that they then covered the whole thing up, because the last thing the German command wanted was for the world to know that one of their most feared generals had been killed by a nun. The humiliation would have been unbearable, and so, according to this theory, Sister Marguerite died alone, in some unmarked grave or some interrogation cell, and her name was simply erased. And the people who believe this theory point out that the German records from that region during that winter are strangely incomplete, that entire pages seem to be missing, that there are references to an investigation that suddenly stops without explanation, and they say that this is exactly what a cover-up looks like. And honestly, when I first read this theory, I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because it is entirely possible that the woman who saved so many lives paid for it with her own, and that we will never know, and that we will never be able to honor her the way she deserved to be honored. And the third theory is the strangest one, and it is the one that I think about the most, because it is the one that keeps the mystery alive, and it is this, that Sister Marguerite did escape, but not to join the resistance, and not to flee the country, but simply to disappear into the fabric of the world, to become one of those anonymous figures who slip through history without leaving a trace. And the people who believe this theory point to something that is hard to argue with. They point out that a woman who could plan and execute the perfect murder of a Nazi general, right under the noses of his own guards, was clearly capable of anything, that if she wanted to vanish, she could vanish, that if she wanted to become someone else, she could become someone else. And they believe that she spent the rest of the war moving quietly from place to place, never staying long, never drawing attention, doing small acts of quiet resistance wherever she went, and then, when the war finally ended, she simply melted into the peace, and she lived out her remaining years somewhere, as someone else, and she died an old woman in a bed somewhere, surrounded by people who knew her by a different name and had no idea that they had been living beside a legend. And now, here is the thing that I find genuinely astonishing, and it is the detail that convinces me, more than anything else, that this story is real, and not just a legend, and it is this, that in the decades after the war, when researchers went back through the records of the convent, they found something strange. They found that there was no record of a nun named Marguerite ever having existed, not a birth record, not a letter, not a single document that connected a real person to that name. And at first, the researchers thought this was just the result of wartime chaos, that records had been lost, that the Germans had destroyed documents when they fled, but then they looked closer, and they realized that the name itself, Marguerite, was not a name at all, or rather, it was a name that had been chosen, and chosen carefully, because in the language of the region, in the old folk stories, the name Marguerite was associated with a particular flower, a small, white, delicate flower. That looks completely harmless, and I want you to think about that for a second, a woman who poisoned a man with a beautiful, harmless-looking flower, and who called herself by the name of a beautiful, harmless-looking flower, and that, right there, is the kind of detail that a novelist would be proud of, the kind of detail that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because it means that whoever Sister Marguerite really was, she was not just a woman who did something brave, she was a woman who understood, on a deep and almost poetic level, the power of appearing to be the last thing in the world that anyone would ever be afraid of. And so here we are, 80 years later, and the mystery of Sister Marguerite is still unsolved, and the general is still dead, and the wine cellar at that convent is still there, and on certain cold winter nights, or so the people of the region say, you can still smell wine on the wind, and the locals will tell you, in hushed voices, that it is her, that it is Sister Marguerite, keeping watch, making sure that the innocent are protected, and I do not know if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe in this. I believe that some stories are so powerful that they refuse to die, and I believe that the story of a quiet nun who faced down evil with nothing but her courage and a bottle of wine is exactly that kind of story, and it is the kind of story that makes me proud to bring you stories like this every single week. And now I want to bring it home to you, because this story is not really about a nun, and it is not really about a Nazi general, and it is not even really about the war. This story is about something much bigger. It is about the moment when an ordinary person, a person who has spent their whole life being invisible, looks evil directly in the face and decides that they will not look away, and I think there is a part of all of us that wonders what we would do in that moment, and whether we would have the courage to do what she did, and that is exactly the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to answer it honestly, because here is what I need you to do right now. I need you to drop a comment below and tell me which of the three theories you believe. Do you think Sister Marguerite joined the resistance? Do you think she was captured and erased by the Germans? Or do you think she simply vanished and lived out her life in secret? Because I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think, and while you are down there, if this story moved you the way it moved me, I need you to share it, send it to one person, just one, because these stories, these hidden stories of incredible women, they only survive if people like you and me keep telling them, and every share means that Sister Marguerite's story, whatever the truth of it is, gets to live on for another generation. And before you go, let me just say this, thank you for staying all the way to the end, because I know there are a million videos fighting for your attention right now, and you chose to spend your time here, with me, listening to a story that most of the world has forgotten, and that means more than I can tell you, and if you are not already subscribed to The Secret Nun, this is the moment to change that, because I have so many more stories like this one, stories about the women who changed history from the shadows, stories about courage and sacrifice and the kind of bravery that never makes it into the history books, and I do not want you to miss a single one of them, so hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell, and I will see you in the next story, and until then, keep the secret.